I never thought I'd be standing at my father's funeral feeling completely invisible, even though I spent more of my life thinking I knew him than anyone else in that room. I'm 28, male, and yeah, complicated family situation. My dad remarried when I was 10, bringing in my stepmom and her son, Alex, who immediately decided I was competition for everything: attention, love, even inheritance, apparently. Growing up, I learned to nod, smile, and avoid him at all costs. My dad tried, I think, but he had his own demons, and by the time he got sick, Alex had convinced him he was the rightful heir to, well, everything. So here I was, in this overly air-conditioned funeral home in downtown Chicago, dressed in a suit that felt 2 sizes too small, trying not to notice the sneers and sideways glances from extended family who clearly favored Alex. He was already standing in front of the casket, arms folded, chest puffed out like he owned the place. And honestly, he sort of thought he did. I kept my distance, standing near the back, listening to people talk about my father's generosity and how proud he'd be of us all. The words felt hollow. I had spent years being told I was the charity case, the mistake, the kid he took in after my mom left us. And Alex, he wasn't subtle. He leaned over to his mom at one point and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Finally, it's going to be mine. All of it." I bit my tongue. Really, I did. I wanted to say something. Anything, but I knew this wasn't the place. Not yet. Funerals aren't for arguments. They're for appearances. And Alex? He was a pro at appearances. Always had been. The service dragged on, the priest's voice echoing off the high ceilings. I zoned out, letting my mind wander back to moments that actually mattered. The nights my dad stayed up helping me with homework even when he was exhausted. The time he drove me 2 hours to a baseball tryout, even though he had chemo the next morning. The stupid Saturday mornings we spent building model airplanes. Those were mine, not Alex's. And yet, as I listened to him make small talk with relatives, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. That bitter mix of anger and sadness that comes from being dismissed for too long. Then came the moment I dreaded, the family lawyer stepping up to read the will. I had heard rumors, sure. My dad had a company, a house in the suburbs, a trust fund. Alex acted like all of it would slide right into his lap. He smiled, adjusting his tie, clearly imagining the life he thought was waiting for him. I stayed silent, not because I didn't want to say something, not because I didn't deserve to speak, but because for once, I wanted to see him believe in something that wasn't real. I wanted to watch him wrestle with his own assumptions. When the lawyer cleared his throat, you could hear a pin drop. And in that quiet, I made a tiny vow to myself. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't lose my composure. I'd let my dad's final words speak for me. The lawyer cleared his throat again, shifting the papers in his hands like he knew exactly how heavy this moment would feel. Everyone straightened, some more eagerly than others. Alex's grin was still smug, that mix of entitlement and pure confidence I'd spent years learning to hate. I stayed at the back, hands clasped in front of me, pretending I wasn't counting down the seconds until he got the first punch in what he thought would be the biggest win of his life. "Thank you all for being here," the lawyer started, voice calm, professional, practiced. "As you know, your father, James Thompson, passed away 2 weeks ago. He left a will, and I'm here to read its contents to ensure everyone understands his wishes." Alex nodded, his eyes bright, like he was watching a movie where he already knew the ending. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. House, company, trust fund, all mine. The lawyer paused, glanced around the room, and then started. "To my beloved family, I leave these instructions and bequests. To my son, Michael, my name." That little flicker in my chest, the one I'd been keeping buried, flared instantly. I had spent decades being dismissed, being told I was the charity case, being compared to Alex, and just hearing my name formally acknowledged by my dad in front of everyone. It was almost surreal. I looked over at Alex. His brow furrowed slightly, confused. He leaned in toward his mom, whispering, probably trying to make sense of what he just heard. "To my son, Michael, I leave my home in Oakwood, my savings account, and my interest in Thompson Industries, including my role as CEO, which I trust he will manage with the same integrity and dedication I've tried to model all these years." The words hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. My jaw tightened. I felt heat rush to my face, but I didn't move, didn't breathe out loud. I let the room react first. Alex's face. Oh, it was something I'll never forget. First came confusion, then disbelief, then that slow, creeping panic as the reality set in. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to protest, but no words came. Not yet. The lawyer continued, glancing down at the next page. To my stepson, Alexander, I leave my personal collection of watches and a small sum in trust, to be accessed when he reaches the age of 30. Beyond that, all decisions regarding the company and family estate are to be executed by Michael. The room went silent. You could literally hear the shuffling of shoes and the soft whimpers of grief that weren't really grief, but the uncomfortable kind of shock that happens when you realize someone has outsmarted your entire life plan, especially when that someone is, by all appearances, the charity case. I stayed still. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't breathe heavy. I just watched him. Alex, the guy who spent years subtly, and not so subtly, undermining me, mocking me, telling anyone who'd listened that I'd never amount to anything, now stood frozen in the middle of the funeral hall, looking like someone just dropped him from a skyscraper and left him to figure out gravity. His mom finally moved, putting a hand on his shoulder, whispering something I couldn't hear. He shook his head violently, backing up like he was trying to erase the words from existence. But there was no undo button, no rewind. My dad's final act of clarity was here, and it was sharp. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, vindication, sadness, loss. Because no matter what, my dad was gone. And all this poetic justice, it wouldn't bring him back. But it was almost comforting to know that for once, the scales were balanced in my favor. That my years of loyalty, of silent suffering, of being underestimated mattered. I glanced around at the rest of the family. Some people looked stunned. Others tried to hide it behind polite clapping or forced smiles. But I didn't care. The only look that mattered was Alex's. Finally, he spoke, voice trembling, faltering between rage and hurt. Wait, he can't. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. The lawyer, clearly used to emotional outbursts, calmly said, "These are the final wishes of James Thompson. They have been notarized and witnessed. Any disputes will need to be handled legally." Alex sank into a chair, head in his hands. His mom muttered something about talking to lawyers, about options, but he didn't even look at her. He looked like he was seeing the floor for the first time in his life and realized it wasn't going to save him. I felt a strange surge of closure, not joy, not smug satisfaction, but closure. All those years of being called a charity case, all those nights wondering if I'd ever be recognized as my father's son, it was finally acknowledged. And it wasn't just a token inheritance. It was the company, the home, the future he had tried to claim. I stayed silent, because silence carried more weight than anything I could say. I let the look on his face be my voice. Let the moment linger. Let him feel the full measure of what he'd assumed was his birthright, now slipping through his fingers. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not by everyone, but by the one person who mattered most, my dad. And that, more than anything else, was enough. After the will reading, the air in the funeral home felt heavier than before. People murmured quietly among themselves, but I didn't move. I just stood there, letting Alex stew in the silence he'd created for himself. I couldn't help but notice the little tells. His jaw tight, hands trembling slightly, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape hatch. That look, the one that says, "I thought I knew the rules, but the game's over," was oddly satisfying, but it also made my chest ache. Because, even though he'd treated me like I didn't belong, he was still my stepbrother, and part of me didn't want to hate him entirely. His mom, predictably, tried to salvage the situation. "We can talk to the lawyer, Alex," she whispered, a hint of panic in her voice. "Maybe there's something. Maybe we can negotiate." He shook his head violently, not meeting her eyes. "No," he muttered. "It's done." Then, after a pause, his voice cracked. He never wanted me to have anything, did he?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The question was rhetorical, and the silence said everything it needed to. My dad had chosen me. After all the years of feeling second best, invisible, like a placeholder in someone else's life, that simple act of recognition, leaving me everything, was louder than any argument Alex could muster. People started drifting out of the room after the service ended. Hugs were exchanged, condolences offered, polite smiles forced. I stayed back for a moment longer, letting the crowd thin. I didn't want to deal with any awkward small talk or pitying looks. Not now. Not when my thoughts were still spinning from the shock of seeing Alex's carefully constructed world crumble. When we finally left the funeral home, the crisp fall air hit me. Chicago in October has this sharp edge that feels like reality itself cutting through any lingering illusion. Alex was walking ahead with his mom, both of them whispering, shoulders tense. I followed at a distance, quiet, letting them have their space. Back at my dad's house, which was now legally mine, the reality sank in. It wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a company. It was a lifetime of memories, a tangible connection to the man who had quietly fought for me, even when life was cruel. And now it was mine to protect, to honor, to carry forward. Alex showed up later that afternoon, after making a few calls, probably to lawyers or anyone who might have told him there was a loophole. He looked disheveled, more like a kid caught stealing than the confident man I'd known. He didn't knock. He didn't even ring the doorbell. He just barged in, clearly assuming I would just fold. "Michael," he said, voice low, trying to mask the panic, the hurt, and whatever leftover arrogance he could muster. "We need to talk. There's got to be something you don't understand." Dad, he couldn't have meant this. I didn't move from the living room couch. I let him pace in front of me, hands running through his hair, face pale. This was the same guy who had mocked me for years, who had spent his life trying to make me feel small, insignificant. And now, here he was, pleading. "You really think yelling or arguing will change it?" I asked finally, voice calm, almost gentle. He made it clear. "Everything's mine. The house, the company, all of it. There's nothing left for you to fight for." He stopped pacing, breathing heavily, like my words were air he couldn't inhale. "You don't get it," he said. "Dad, he can't just leave me nothing." I shook my head slowly. He could, and he did, because he knew who I was, because he knew who cared. And it wasn't about money. It was about respect, loyalty, the years I spent being his son, not the charity case you think you've always been. For a moment, I saw something like understanding flicker in his eyes. But then it hardened again, a mix of denial and rage. "You're gloating," he spat. "This isn't fair. You don't deserve any of this." I didn't rise to his bait. I didn't need to. Silence spoke louder than any insult. He could throw words, threaten legal action, call me names, but he couldn't take away the truth. My dad had chosen me. That was unchangeable. Hours later, he left, storming out in a mix of anger and disbelief, muttering about lawyers and lawsuits. I didn't follow. I didn't call after him. I didn't need to. Watching him leave, shoulders slumped, face tight with frustration, gave me a strange sense of closure. Not triumph, not revenge, just the quiet, undeniable fact that truth had a way of landing exactly where it was supposed to. I spent the rest of the evening alone in my dad's office, flipping through papers, letters, and photographs he had left. Old memories, business records, personal notes. It was overwhelming. The responsibility alone was immense, but so was the weight of being seen, finally, for who I really was. Not the charity case, not the second choice. His son. By the time the sun set over Chicago, I understood something important. This inheritance wasn't just financial. It was emotional. It was validation. It was the kind of closure you can't buy, the kind that comes from knowing that someone who mattered, someone whose opinion shaped your life, knew your worth when it truly counted. And Alex? He'd eventually figure it out. That mix of disbelief, anger, and jealousy wouldn't fade overnight. But I'd already found my peace. My dad's last message wasn't just the will. It was him, finally giving me the acknowledgement I'd been denied for so long. And for the first time in years, I let myself breathe. The first week after the funeral was surreal. I kept going back and forth between the house and Thompson Industries, trying to wrap my head around the reality that my dad's life, his company, his legacy, was now mine. I wasn't a naive kid anymore. I'd grown up under Alex's shadow, watching him think he could take over anything without working for it. But now the tables had turned, and I had to figure out how to do justice to my dad's vision without letting ego or resentment cloud my judgment. Walking into the office for the first time as CEO felt like stepping onto a stage I'd been rehearsing for my entire life without realizing it. Staffers who had treated Alex like a prodigy suddenly looked at me differently. Some eyes were cautious, some curious, and a few, well, they were silently cheering. I could feel the shift immediately. I wasn't just the charity case anymore. I was the guy in charge. Alex, of course, couldn't resist trying to insert himself into the picture. He showed up unannounced one morning, tie crooked, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Michael, we need to talk about the company," he said, trying to sound assertive, trying to command respect he had never earned. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, watching him flail. "About what exactly?" I asked, voice calm measured. "The company isn't a playground, Alex. It's not yours, and it hasn't been for a long time. It's mine now." He scoffed, frustration evident. "Dad made mistakes. You don't understand the first thing about running this. You're going to ruin everything." I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I let him ramble, like I had let him talk over me as a kid, waiting for him to run out of energy. "Do you really think yelling and telling me what I'm going to ruin changes anything?" I finally asked. "Dad made his decision. You didn't earn this." "I did, and I intend to honor his work, not yours." The realization hit him slowly. The same realization I'd seen at the funeral, stretched out over months, when he started noticing that no matter what he said, no matter what he demanded, nothing could undo my father's choice. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in the company's operations. I met with department heads, reviewed budgets, studied ongoing projects. It was exhausting but strangely satisfying. Every corner of the company reflected my dad's touch, his dedication, his grit. And as I started making decisions, I felt a sense of ownership that Alex had never even glimpsed. Alex, predictably, tried small sabotage attempts, questioning my decisions in meetings, sending passive-aggressive emails to staffers, even hinting at hiring his own advisors. I ignored most of it. I stayed professional, kept my eyes on the bigger picture. Let him burn his own bridges while I built mine. The turning point came when I decided to announce a new initiative, a mentorship program for young employees, inspired by the way my dad had always guided me. I presented it to the board, and despite Alex's attempts to undermine me, everyone nodded, excited, energized. For the first time, it felt like the company was responding to me, not just my dad's ghost. Alex cornered me in the lobby that afternoon, frustration finally boiling over. "You think this proves anything? You think you're him? You're just lucky, that's all. Dad died, and somehow you got everything handed to you. That doesn't make you capable." I looked him in the eye, calm but firm. "No, luck has nothing to do with it. I spent years learning from him, watching him work, listening when he told me things you ignored. I may not have had the title, but I had the education he actually cared about passing on. And now, I get to apply it." He froze. His mouth opened, closed. No words came. The silence said everything that needed to be said. It wasn't about gloating. I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. And at that moment, I realized something crucial. Alex didn't get it because he never earned it. All he had was entitlement. And entitlement collapses under responsibility. The next few weeks were a balancing act. I had to maintain professional boundaries with Alex, ensure the company's operations didn't stall, and navigate family politics without losing my mind. It wasn't easy. Sometimes I stayed in the office until late, poring over documents, ensuring every decision was intentional. Other times, I caught myself staring at old photos of my dad, trying to imagine what he would have done in a tricky situation, feeling the weight of living up to his legacy pressing down on me. Through it all, Alex's presence faded. He realized that legal threats and emotional manipulations weren't going to undo the will. He tried, sure, but it became clear he was outmatched not by luck or power, but by experience, by knowledge, and by the quiet truth that my dad had seen in me what he never saw in Alex: commitment, loyalty, and grit. I remember one afternoon, walking through the office, seeing Alex sitting quietly in the conference room, head down, sketching something on a pad. Not a meeting, not a confrontation. Just sitting. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. The lesson was sinking in. The recognition that life doesn't owe him anything, that years of entitlement don't equal competence. By the time I left the office that evening, the city skyline glowing orange in the sunset, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won, not because I had money or power, but because finally, the person who mattered most, my dad, had made his choice, and I had honored it. Everything else, including Alex, was secondary. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. Not as a charity case, not as the second choice, but as the son my dad had always known I could be. Months had passed since the funeral, and the dust had finally started to settle. Thompson Industries was running smoother than I could have imagined. The board respected me. The employees, especially the ones who had quietly cheered me on from the start, looked to me for guidance. And Alex? He'd become a shadow in the office, less brash, more cautious. It was obvious he realized by now that the world didn't bend for him, no matter how much he thought it should. One late afternoon, I was in my dad's office, going through some old letters he had kept, when I heard a knock on the door. I looked up. Alex. He looked smaller somehow. His usual swagger was gone. His eyes weren't pleading or challenging. They were tired. Real tired. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice quieter than I'd ever heard from him. I nodded. Sure. He stepped in slowly, almost cautiously, and sat in the chair across from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The office smelled faintly of old leather and wood polish, familiar smells that made the room feel like a time capsule of my dad's life. Finally, he spoke. I wanted to say something. He paused, like he was measuring the weight of the words. I was wrong. About everything. I treated you like you didn't matter. Like Dad didn't see you the way he saw me. I didn't interrupt. I just let him speak. This was the moment he needed, not me. I thought I deserved it all just because I was his biological son, he continued. And I couldn't see that he valued loyalty, effort, integrity, the things I didn't understand. I thought this company, this life, would just fall into my lap. And now I see it won't. It won't, because I never earned it. I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was relief, yes, but more than that, it was closure. For years, I had been waiting for someone, anyone, to see the truth of my worth. Alex saying it now, in his own awkward, broken way, was enough. I can't change the past, he said, voice trembling slightly. I can't undo the things I said, the things I did. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see you. And I'm sorry. I nodded slowly. It's taken you a while, but that's enough. You don't have to prove anything else. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to do what Dad wanted. And if you're willing to be part of that, we can find a place for you. But only if you're sincere. He swallowed hard, nodded once. I am. It wasn't an instant transformation. Alex wouldn't suddenly become someone else overnight. But for the first time, there was a crack in his armor. And I could see that if he chose to walk through it, he might actually grow. In the following weeks, I started including him in meetings, small things at first. Mentoring sessions, observing company operations, helping with minor projects. He still bristled sometimes, still slipped into old habits. But there was progress. More importantly, there was mutual respect. He realized the company wasn't a playground for entitlement, and I realized I didn't need to carry years of resentment for him to find his own place. One evening, I stayed late in the office, looking out at the skyline. Chicago had that quiet glow when the city slows down, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep, steady peace. The house, the company, the inheritance, none of that mattered as much as the feeling of finally being acknowledged, of finally belonging. My dad had made his choice, and it wasn't arbitrary. It was deliberate. It was justice, sure, but it was also love. And Alex? He was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but learning. Watching him come to terms with his mistakes, seeing him wrestle with humility for the first time in his life, it was almost like watching a person grow before your eyes. Not satisfying in a petty way, but in a real, human way. I kept Dad's office mostly as it was, filled with his notes, his photos, his little quirks that made it feel like him. Sitting there, I realized something important. The inheritance wasn't just money or property. It was trust. It was recognition. It was the ability to continue his legacy and, in doing so, honor everything he had taught me about work, loyalty, and family. A few weeks later, Alex approached me with a proposal. Not a demand, not a threat, a proposal. He wanted to head a new project, a community outreach initiative that Thompson Industries had discussed briefly before Dad passed. He asked me for guidance. He didn't assume, he didn't demand. He asked. I smiled, a real quiet smile. Let's do it, I said. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just holding on to my dad's company. I was building something bigger. A family that could survive mistakes, a legacy that could endure challenges, and a future that honored my father without being trapped by past grudges. The look on Alex's face when I agreed, half relief, half disbelief, wasn't triumph. It was understanding. The understanding that comes when someone finally realizes they can't take shortcuts through life, and that recognition and effort matter more than entitlement. For the first time since Dad passed, I felt truly at peace. Not because I won anything, but because the one person whose opinion mattered most, my father, had trusted me to carry his life forward. Everything else, including Alex, was secondary. And that trust, that acknowledgement was enough. I leaned back in Dad's chair, letting the city lights blur through the window. I finally understood what he had been trying to teach me all along. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about being worthy of it. And now, finally, I was.